So today we have talking to us Dr. Hannah August, who is a lecturer in the School of English and Media Studies, who has written both for academic and for broader public audiences. So Hannah is going to talk to us today a little bit about her experiences and her strategies as a writer. So welcome to Hannah.
Thank you, Hannah. This is going to be very confusing for you guys, but I'm sure you will do.
So could you tell us a little bit about your background and the writing that you've done for both academic and broader public audiences?
Sure. So I did a PhD in England that I finished in 2013, and obviously that process really honed my writing skills when it comes to, I suppose, academic discourse. And I didn't do a whole lot of non-academic writing while I was doing my PhD. I did write some theatre reviews that were for a blog that was hosted by my university in the UK, and they were for I suppose, envisaged for a broader audience, but they were still written with I suppose I still had my academics hat on when I was writing them, and then when I moved back to New Zealand at the end of 2013, I didn't have an academic job, and I thought, well, I still want to write, and there are things that I care about that I want to try and talk about in the world that are not Shakespearean drama, which is what my PhD had been on. And so I sort of started thinking about how I could do that within this quite different context that I suddenly found myself in, because I'd been in the UK for 6 years. And one of the things that I had always thought that I might like to write about and hadn't felt that I maybe had the, I suppose, social science-y expertise to write about was this phenomenon of the man drought, which crops up in the media in New Zealand quite a bit. We've got what is technically known as a gender ratio imbalance in New Zealand, whereby there are
Doesn't sound as catchy.
Doesn't sound quite as catchy, no. There are significantly more, once you hit kind of, I think it's the age of 33, there are significantly more women in that age bracket heading forward kind of from your 30s on into your 80s than there are men, and this gets referred to by the media as a man drought, and it often gets referred to in a particularly reductive fashion and in a way that doesn't really take into account what actual women's experiences of living in a society where there's very much an expectation that most people will couple off, that they will buy houses together and have families together, and that in itself is obviously very heterosexist, but still those expectations prevail. And so a lot of the writing around the man drought, from kind of articles in the mass media through to more academic working papers, tends to recycle some stereotypical assumptions about what women will do and what their lives will look like. And I wanted to kind of unpack some of that, and one of the ways that I thought I could do that would be by talking to a whole bunch of single women about their experiences and kind of collating that interview material and setting it alongside sort of, I suppose, discourse analysis or critique, which was what I had been trying to do in my time as a PhD student, and create a publication that married those two things and kind of upended our assumptions about this man drought. And so I wrote a book proposal. I kind of jotted down my ideas with the kind of in a fit of passion one afternoon, I suppose, and sent it off to a small independent publishing company here in Wellington called Bridget Williams Books, who had recently started publishing this series of short kind of pamphlet style books that they called BWB texts, and these are all between kind of 15 to 25,000 words long. I knew that I probably wasn't going to have time to, if I was working in a non-academic job at the same time, I wasn't going to have time to write anything longer than that. And I said, here's what I'd like to write about. Would you be interested? And they were looking for kind of more younger female voices to join the texts list at that point, and they said yes, and they commissioned it, and I was lucky enough to get a grant from the New Zealand Society of Authors. It was a grant that was co-offered by the New Zealand Society of Authors and the Copyright Licensing Trust of New Zealand, and that enabled me to have 2 weeks at the Stout Research Centre at Victoria in Wellington to do all those interviews and to work on it. And I produced the manuscript at the end of it and kind of served it up to BWB, and then realised just how much I had kind of tried to invent this new writing style and persona for myself without even really thinking about what that would look like. I knew it couldn't be written in the same kind of academic jargon that I had written my PhD, but I wasn't quite sure what it should look like other than that, and I think I sort of did my best, but the editing process was certainly a bit brutal as I attempted to transition from from the way that I'd been writing as a PhD student to writing for the public.
Right. That's awesome. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, especially because, so you sort of mentioned that there was this public conversation that you saw yourself as wanting to intervene in a particularly kind of critical way that you'd almost been trained to do academically. But then at some point the project takes on a life of its own, and then you find yourself with this manuscript that maybe you hadn't predicted in every way possible. So could you tell us a bit more about how the project evolved and how your voice evolved as you kind of worked on the materials that you'd gathered?
Yeah, it's I think the first point at which I sort of knew that I'd written something maybe slightly different from what I thought I was setting out to write was when the readers' reports came back after the first draft had been sitting with the publisher for a while, and the readers' reports all said, we just loved the women's stories, and they really had latched onto the interview material, and I'd kind of meant for the interview material to act as colour to this critical argument that I was making, and whereas they saw the interview material as being much more at the heart of what the project was, and it had, I think, grafted onto it because it brought out quite vividly these actual women's real life stories and experiences, and that's really compelling for readers. It's much more compelling for an average reader than an academic argument that kind of tears strips off the sloppy language used by entertainment journalists, right? And but I hadn't necessarily anticipated that, and I think there was a bit of a, I did try and push back because I sort of prided myself on the critical skills that I'd acquired throughout my doctoral training, and I kind of wanted to showcase those as well. But after a certain point, I mean, one of the things that you learn the first time that you work with a publisher is that at a certain point it's no longer your baby, it's just as much their baby, and all sorts of things mean contribute to a book's final state, and often a book's final state is simply to do with deadlines. You could keep tinkering with a manuscript forever and ever and ever, but ultimately there is a date on which it has to go to press, yes. And the form in which it is on that date is the form in which readers are going to encounter it.
And a certain timeliness for writing for the public too, and that you probably wanted to get that intervention out before man-drought discourse persisted much longer in its current state.
That's right.
So in your answer just now, you mentioned that you almost, by the end of the manuscript, you'd found yourself taking on maybe a slightly different relationship to the material of those women's voices, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, and that it is a slightly different stance towards your material from that academic distance, if you feel like or part of the project at least, is to give voice to people that wouldn't otherwise have voice, or to sort of bring perspectives in that wouldn't otherwise be there.
I think I did, a lot of that project I kind of did everything blind. Like, I didn't know necessarily what, for instance, I'd never done much interviewing before. And I mean, everybody signed kind of release forms, and it was all above board in that respect, and all of my interviewees were anonymised in the book in the end. But it's certainly the sort of thing where if I'd been doing it within a university, I would have been made to go through a really rigorous ethics committee application process in order, and some of the things that came up in the conversations that I had with those women were kind of full on in terms of the experiences that they were sharing and some of the things that they were telling me about their mental health. And in hindsight, I possibly wasn't best equipped to deal with that, and I only really became conscious of that in hindsight. I mean, I had a lot of good feedback from my interviewees when the book eventually came out, and I'm confident that I handled it as best I could, but I'd sort of gone into it without, I suppose, the sort of awareness that I would have had, A, if I'd been an academic who had more regularly worked in those sorts of areas, or B, if I'd been a journalist with more awareness of kind of journalistic practice and ethos, and attempting to sort of stride out into this territory that was kind of between those things meant that I didn't know quite so much about how I should be doing that in terms of the approaches that I should be taking.
Yeah, no, it's a definitely complicated territory. I wonder if you could say a bit about how you see that balance of story and argument, or the interaction of story and argument in the kind of writing that you wanted to do, or that you were modelling your own work on, because it is one issue that the students have read about, just thinking about maybe that imperative to storify everything, and for things to only sort of take on resonance when they have a very strong story component. I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I suppose I'm instinctively quite resistant to the idea of privileging story over argument. And for instance, one of the decisions that I made with that book was not to put any of my own story into it, and I had certainly spent quite a lot of time belonging to the demographic of the women that I was interviewing, but I felt like putting my own personal voice in it would sort of detract from my academic authority to a certain extent. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, and there are certainly writers who I admire who do manage to hit that balance, but I didn't. I suppose I felt that too much story would pull people's focus away, would mean that my argument wouldn't land in quite the way that I wanted it to. And I think there is a really fine balance to be found between, often I think you can use story to frame things, and the manuscript that I've written most recently, which is about something completely different. It's about kind of how we value humanities study and research in New Zealand. I've got a kind of coda where I talk in the first person about my own experiences as a student of the humanities, and subsequently as someone who teaches in the humanities in a university. But I felt like I felt like that was quite a nice way to earth the ideas that had gone previously by kind of wrapping it all up with that bit of personal story, but I didn't feel like it would kind of marry with my aims throughout the manuscript as a whole, and in terms of the argument that I wanted to make. I think partly it's that I don't feel that we see enough argument in things that are written for a more public audience, and I think actually the general public is quite capable of taking on board arguments, and it's good to put, I feel like there's kind of an imperative to put arguments out there and force people to take them on board. Do a little bit of work just occasionally, so yeah.
So did you feel like your writing style or your writing processes changed as you negotiated this slightly different territory, even though, say, argument remained maybe as much of a priority for you as it was when you were doing more academic prose? Can you think of any examples of how you shifted either the way you compose something, or at a sentence level, or a document level, or whatever comes to mind? I
mean, I've certainly noticed, the manuscript that I've just written, my writing style has definitely moved on yet further from where it was when I was writing the Mandrout text, and I was lucky to have a really great editor who sort of edited in quite an interventionist fashion before that came out, and a lot of it is at the sentence level. I mean, I had been used to writing these very long, kind of complex, multi-clause sentences, that, like, to me they felt perfectly clear, but they conveyed a lot of information in one syntactical package, and you just can't do that for something that particularly people are going to encounter often on the web or on an e-reader, where you simply the BWB texts, for instance, they are really little books, and so a sentence that might be kind of 2 or 3 lines in a normal sized book will take up half a page, and that's really difficult for a reader, and so you have to, it's exactly the same sort of considerations as you have to bear in mind when you're writing for the web. One of the main things is that my sentences became a lot shorter, and I think I also began to compose paragraphs in a slightly more, I suppose, conversational style. I spend so much time teaching my students in my English literature courses at Massey that a paragraph needs to have a topic sentence and then the evidence in the middle and then a summary. They're incredibly structured, but actually in the writing that I do for the public now, that's not the way that I write paragraphs, because that's not the way that most people are used to seeing paragraphs. And I write a lot of reviews now for publications like The Listener and Metro, and I certainly wouldn't write those type of incredibly structured paragraphs for them.
So what would you say are some of the challenges that you've encountered with writing for the public, and any strategies that you might suggest to deal with those challenges, if you have those in mind as well?
So one of the things that happened when my book about the Mandrout came out, which is called No Country for Old Maids, talking about the Mandrout.
I'll put the information on the screen.
There we go, that's right. I believe the ebook because it's $4.99. Anyway, one of the things that happened, so it's a book that's partly about how the media in New Zealand pays a really disproportionate amount of attention to this topic, right? And there's a kind of prurience that they exhibit towards single women, and it comes out in relation to this topic. And what happened when my book came out was that they paid a really disproportionate amount of attention to it. And so suddenly I had to, I went from someone who'd kind of never really done any public media engagement to having to speak to Catherine Ryan on 9 to Noon, having to do Q&A and breakfast television and be interviewed for the Sunday magazine, for the Don Post, and speak to Duncan Garner, and just suddenly this enormous amount of media attention that I wasn't particularly equipped to deal with. I'd had sort of 1 hour of kind of cursory media training, and also the way that you are expected to deal with the media these days is in a much more in a much blunter fashion than I wanted to. The whole point of my book had been to nuance the discussion around this topic, and if you have to present a bunch of sound bites getting your point across on something like Breakfast TV, where you have a kind of 5-minute segment, there's no room for nuance. I think the most nuanced I managed to get was with Catherine Ryan in a kind of 25-minute slot on 9 to Noon, and that's partly because she's a smart feminist interviewer, and so I did find that really tricky. Like, how do you do the kind of meta presentation of what you have written? If you want people to read what you have written, how do you, I guess, advertise it to them and brand yourself in a way that isn't disingenuous in terms of what you've actually created within that publication?
Yeah, and it's tricky, isn't it? Because you really are trying to intervene in the dominant public with that project. And I can imagine there was probably some quite interesting responses, maybe from the smaller feminist counter-public, that just wouldn't necessarily translate back into that broader public domain, where maybe, as you say, you don't have as much opportunity to represent the project with nuance. One of the things we look at in the course is thinking about how both, citation and circulation as well as active writing are quite important today. Do you feel like it's circulated beyond, what you could possibly have predicted? What's the afterlife of a piece of public writing?
Well, I mean, interestingly, somebody texted me just the other day. So it came out in at the end of 2015. Mid 2000, about this time, August 2015, I think. And and a friend messaged me just the other day to say, they were talking about your book on RNZ, and some other bit of research, I don't know, about kind of relationship formation had come out, and one of the people who was on RNZ's panel said, there's this whole book that's got all of the stats in it, and she had a copy of my book there and read a bit of it out, and I was really interested to see that it was having that afterlife, where it was obviously still kind of considered a go-to text to offer a different and more kind of nuanced feminist perspective on the topic, and it's been kind of I suppose things have spun off its publication for me personally. I mean, a lot of the reviewing that I have done since, I would never have been asked to do that by the people that asked me to do it had I not developed a bit of a public profile off the back of that book. I've done speaking events in sort of smaller, what did you call them before? Minority publics or something. What was the term that you... Counter publics, there we go. So for instance, I went and talked to the secondary school teachers, are they the PPTA, Post-Primary Teachers Association? Their annual conference last year, someone who was involved with them asked me to come and talk about the book and about some of the issues that it raised. And of course, secondary school, the women in that particular sphere just were all over this book. They were absolutely one of the kind of, I suppose, an unknown target market for it, and they responded really well to my speech, and they bought a whole lot of books afterwards, and I realised that there were sort of pockets of people that it was going to appeal to and continue to appeal to.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us about your experience.
It's been my pleasure.
That was Dr. Hannah August from the School of English and Media Studies.